Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. Welcome back. Let's dive right into what we're going to do today. This is lecture 19 in our lecture series on image processing. And if you remember, shortly before the Christmas break, I promised you that from now on it'll be fun. And indeed that is the case, because today we're going to talk about image warping. That's actually a topic that will keep us busy for the next couple of lectures. But in order to really compute image warps, things like these, so if this is the original image, and we want to do crazy stuff with the images, like, say, as in here, or in here, or in here, we have to understand the notion of interpolation. So it'll be great fun from now on, because we'll talk about warping, but today our focus will be on interpolation, so that we can appreciate the techniques that allow us to compute images like that. Can you see that these three images are basically somehow distorted versions of this one? All right, great. This is what we are going to do. We want to understand how we practically compute transformations like these. Right? Again, what we are given is an image, and we do something with it. The difference to what we have been doing recently, when we are talking about things like, say, the Fourier transform, we considered the image as a whole. We'll now look into transformations of the coordinates of images. And once again, we understand images like these as discrete functions. That is, functions that are being defined over a set of coordinates, say, x and y direction. And in order to appreciate these kind of transformations, we have to ever so briefly familiarize ourselves with the terminology. And I say that a warp function is a transformation, let's say capital T, that alters the geometry of an image. So we are now concerned with transformations that do something to the coordinates over which an image is defined. In other words, if we are given an image, say g of u and v, or in a shorter way, I'll write the two-dimensional coordinates u and v as a coordinate vector u. Now, if this function defined over two coordinates u and v denotes the original image, the image we are given, and we assume that the warped image, the image we want to produce, is called h, and for reasons that will become clear very shortly, I said that this h is defined over coordinates x and y. Now, if this h denotes the warped image, and if these coordinates x and y are being produced given the coordinates u and v, for instance, applying a certain transformation to u and v to produce the x coordinate, and apply another transformation to u and v to produce the y coordinate. Or, again, in a shorter form, we may write that the coordinate vector x results from applying a certain transformation to the coordinate vector u. And this is not a matrix vector multiplication. Those can be crazy transformations. Look, I mean, these are highly nonlinear transformations, right? So this is not matrix vector multiplication, but it is a function t that we apply to the coordinates u of the given image g. Then, what a warp function does is, it produces an image x simply, h of x, simply by doing something to the coordinates u of an image g. And a picture says 1,000 words. Here is what I have been talking about on the previous slide. We are given a function, g of u. This function is an image, all right? And it is a funny function here because look at this. It sort of is defined from 0 to some maximum x value, or u value I should say, from 0 to some maximum v value. There's lots of black around here. I did that for didactic purposes because in this image, what I have done to create this one here is I applied a transformation to the coordinates of the given image, and that produced a new image. This one here is called h of x. And once again, what the previous slide just said is that in this new image, h, at coordinate x, we observe a value, in our case, white or very bright for this pixel here in this crosshair. In this new image, at x, we observe a value that comes from this image at u. uv. xy, uv. So this is basically the notion of a walk function. What we do is we do not change the intensity values of the image we are given. What we do is we do something to its coordinates, and that produces a new image. Right? And this is what we're going to study. Like warps like these. And this here, of course, was what kind of a transformation?
Rotation.
Yeah, rotation. And that is a linear transformation or not?
Linear.
That's a linear one, right? We'll do more interesting things later on. How do we do this? How do we transform something like this into something like that? Intuitive or naive idea would be to consider something that is called a push warp. And this term push or forward warp defines or refers to the following procedure. We are given a source image G, and we iterate over all its pixels. Right? So basically, if we think of it naively, it's two for loops, one for loop over all the rows, one for loop over all the columns, two nested loops. We iterate over all the pixels at coordinates u in this image G, and compute the corresponding transformation T of u that gives us a new coordinate x. And in the destination image h, at x we set the intensity or color value we found at u in the given image. Or in a more verbose manner, push warps refer to the following procedure. We read intensity or color values in the source image at coordinate uv. We compute this coordinate transformation to obtain a new coordinate x, and we set the intensity or color that we have read in G at u. This color will be set in H at x and y. So this is what push warps do. And in terms of a picture, we can think of it like that. And I have also brought some Python code. Now, here you can see the two for loops. Apparently, the outer one iterates over all the rows, R max, so there's a maximum number of rows. The inner one iterates over all the columns. And then the warp I am computing here is apparently just a scaling, so this is indeed a linear transformation. It scales the x dimension of the coordinates. So that is, we have a coordinate u and v, and remember that if we are talking about arrays, this is how they are represented in the memory. The row index comes first, right? So this is why I'm iterating over the rows first and then the columns. But anyway, we are given coordinate u and v. We apply a certain transformation to that. In this case, a very trivial transformation. We just multiply the column coordinate by 4. We don't do anything to the row coordinate. And if well, this new coordinate x is a value that is not beyond the dimensions of the image. So we make sure that we are good. If that is the case, then in the new image at coordinates y and x, we can set the value in the old image at u and v. And here is a picture illustrating this particular warp. So for the first coordinate u and v, it will go to here. Well, I always say it's probably if this is 0, 0, it will not go to there, but say it's 1, 1, whatever, right? Doesn't matter. This one will be mapped to this pixel in H, and this pixel in G will be mapped to this pixel in H. And here's how that looks like. What has happened?
Scales in x direction.
Yeah, that's all right. That was to be expected, but what could be the problem here? What intensity values should we set here? Bad, eh? This approach, these push warps or forward warps, are a bad idea because if we iterate over the coordinates in the original image G and apply certain transformations to them, we have no guarantee that there will be a value for every pixel in the new image H. And this one illustrates that this method of forward warping may leapfrog, sort of jump over or ignore certain coordinates in the destination image. So for instance, like for some row, like given this scaling along the x direction, and here I have the x value first, but again, it doesn't matter. For some row, the 0 coordinate, x0 coordinate, will be mapped to the 0 coordinate. Like if we multiply 0 by 4, nothing happens, right? The fourth one will come from the first coordinate in G, and the eighth one from the second coordinate in G. Right? This is exactly what this scaling by times 4 does. But then what about those guys? They're not there. Oh, that's bad. But there's a solution. And this solution is called backward or pull warps. And this term, pull warp, refers to the following idea. We exploit the fact that these transformations we are interested in hopefully can be inverted. And that is to say, if we are given a coordinate x in the destination image, the corresponding coordinate u in the original image can be obtained by applying the inverse transform. Right? Therefore, we can iterate over all the pixels in the new image, in the destination image. Right? And compute the intensity values from the corresponding coordinates in the source image. But this, of course, ensures that every pixel in the new image will be considered. So that is, this time we iterate over the image we actually want to compute and pull the intensity or color values from the given one. Here is how that looks like. Look, now we iterate over x and y, that is the rows in the new image and the columns in the new image. And we apply the inverse transformation. And of course, the inverse of times 4 is dividing by 4. So for every x in this new image, we divide the corresponding column coordinate by 4 and get the corresponding coordinate in the original image. All right? And here is how that looks like. Much better. Because now there are no black columns here. Those were basically black because I didn't know what value to set there. And if I'm ignorant about what to do there, I just set it to 0. But is there a problem with this one? Let me try to freeze this in your minds. And let me go back 2 slides. 4. Can you see a difference other than that we are not iterating over v and u and not computing x and y, but computing u? So have a look at this one, maybe at the very last line of that. And at this one, maybe at the very last line of that. Is there a difference? Yeah, there is this resample. Why is it there? Looking at this picture, what would you say is a probable difficulty with this idea of pull warping?
For some pixels, there are no exact pixels.
Exactly. Look, some of those arrows, let's say we go for this one here, and then I try to trace this back and it ends up here. That is, it ends up, like this is sure, right? If we divide, I don't know, 1 by 4, that is 1 over 4, but that is not an integer value. That is not a coordinate for which we do have a value in the original image. Here, some of these intensity values apparently have to be read from in between the given pixel values. Right? That seems to be a problem. It is less of a problem than this issue we had with the push warps, but we have to think about what to do with these pull warps, with these inverse functions that end up in between given pixels. So once again, this is how that looks like. And this procedure is guaranteed not to leapfrog any pixel in the new image, which is great, because we can compute a color value or intensity value for every pixel in the new image. It guarantees that we can do that. However, this value, the value we have to set in the new image, may have to be read, I say, from a location in between the given discrete coordinates of the original image G. And this is why we have to study interpolation today. Okay, and so we are now talking about interpolation, and that is what will keep us busy for the rest of today. And then we'll have lots of fun and fun with warps next time. So how do we interpolate? What possible approaches are there, and what is interpolation anyway? And for the sake of the simplicity of the argument, today I will discuss the problem of one-dimensional interpolation. That is, today I will discuss the problem of interpolating functions over a single variable. Next time we'll extend that to the 2D case. So our problem is that we are given a discrete function, let's call it f, and it assumes values at certain discrete coordinates, which I call xi. And instead of coordinates, I may also say sample points. And what we want to obtain is an approximation f hat, and this time the parentheses are actually parentheses and not brackets, which is to say that this is somehow a continuous function. And we want to have a function f hat that in a sense behaves like the discrete function f, but instead of only having values at certain discrete coordinates xi, it is supposed to also have values at, well, coordinates x, continuous coordinates x, that may, or typically are, located in between a pair of given sample points. And before we continue, I'm already saying that, in general, these 2 points, like say x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, they don't have to be equidistant. That is the distance between any 2 such points, maybe some arbitrary number, 2, 15.5. However, we are interested in digital images. And for digital images, of course, these points indicate pixel coordinates, right? And they are equidistant. The distance between any 2 pixel coordinates in one direction is always 1. So this is great because we can somewhat simplify our lives by assuming that these discrete coordinates are equidistant. Okay, and once again to illustrate this previous slide, here is the problem we are dealing with. Be careful because here I sort of discussed the problem from the tail towards the head and not from the head towards the tail. So here, and this is just for illustration, right? What we are given is a continuous function that I call f of x, and we sample that function. So at certain discrete coordinates, we just read the value of this blue function, and well, this sampling process yields this sampled function or this discrete function. And I'm discussing it from this direction because now that we are going to study interpolation techniques, we can actually have a look at how good different interpolation techniques are because we know the original continuous function. Once again, for digital images, there is no continuous function. Everything that we are given is this, and we want to produce something that is smooth. Right? The fact that here is a continuous function indicated in blue is just for didactic purposes. It has nothing to do with image processing. All right? But this is the function. It's apparently a sine of 2x times x squared, so looks crazy. And the black dots are the values of this blue function at 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. And one idea of how to interpolate in between any 2 given values, it could be to apply the idea of nearest neighbor interpolation. That is to say, we produce a new function f hat which assumes the value of f at coordinate xi if this x is closer to xi than to any other of the sample points. And this is what we get this way. It's like, this step thingy here. And here you see the didactic purpose of that. So the original function is the blue one, and this is our interpolated function. And this is a poor interpolation, right? It is definitely now a function, the orange one, f hat, is sort of continuous. There are these jump discontinuities, blah, 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 blah. But for every x value, we can compute this function. In particular, we can compute it in between any 2 sample points. And we do that by basically, we are given one coordinate x, and we look at the 2 closest discrete coordinates, xi and xi plus 1, and set the value of f hat at x to the value of f of xi, where xi is the one that is closer. Nearest neighbor interpolation. Here's another idea. We can assume that this interpolation function f hat we are interested in is not a step function, but it consists of lots of line segments. That is to say, we assume that this f hat is piecewise linear. So in between each of the given sample points, we approximate f hat in terms of a line. Right? This is very easy to be done. Look at this picture here. I don't even have to discuss that there. So we are given, so we're interested in the value of the interpolation function at this coordinate x, which is in between xi and xi plus 1. And we know that this length is to this length what this length is to this length, right? This is the so-called theorem of intersecting lines. This picture says it all. Once again, this length is to this one as this to that. We can use that to compute the length of this line segment here, right? And if we add this length to this value, we end up here, and that is basically our interpolation point. So how, do we use that? We basically call this tiny segment here, we call it delta. And we know that delta is to x minus xi, what the value of the discrete function at xi plus 1 is to the value of the discrete function at xi over the distance between those two sample points. And we solve that for delta, and there we are. Right? This is linear interpolation. Is this a good idea? Yes, it is. It's of certain value in practice. Certain value in practice. I say in Python we may implement this as so. Of course, professionals would not do it like that. All right. But this is just to show that this mathematics immediately translates to program code. This works, no problem there. You can definitely do it like this. I would not suggest to do that. There are faster ways. But this is a straightforward, naive implementation of the mathematics we just discussed. And here you see the effect of linear interpolation, and again for didactic purposes with respect to this continuous blue function. Now this looks better, right? It's certainly not as crude as the nearest neighbor interpolation. But still, we are not happy. It looks better, but we can do so much better. We can do so much better. I say that both the methods we have discussed so far are rather imprecise. Which is to say, we can actually make this notion of imprecision, we can make that rigorous. We could compute the interpolation error. That is the distance, or let's call it a distance. The distance between the original function, the blue one for our didactic purposes, the blue one, and the one we have interpolated from the sample points. Right? We can express this as an integral, and it's supposed to be a distance, so we take the norm of that integral. This is a way of computing the quality of the interpolation in between any two sample points, right? We have to compute lots of these things, but we can do that if we would want to. We don't, but if we were to do it, we would find that this value E is rather large, or fairly large. This is poor. We want to do better. And here is what we can do. Let me go back to this one. When I say that we may assume the interpolated function in between any two sample points to be linear, or piecewise linear, because now this is a linear piece, this is a linear piece, this is a linear piece, and so on and so forth. A line is, of course, a very polynomial of rather low order. Order 1. What if we were to use higher order polynomials? So instead of constant values, as in the case of nearest neighbor interpolation, or first order polynomials, as in the case of a linear interpolation. We will now consider the idea of using higher order polynomials. And this, you know, this is a bag of fantastically many possibilities as to what we can do there. And I will only discuss two possible solutions, but there are literally hundreds, thousands, 10,000s out there. So these are two methods. The first one is again just for didactic purposes, and the second one is the one everybody uses. So be prepared. The first idea we could think of is to interpolate using Lagrange polynomials. And that is to say, if we are given, say, n+1 discrete coordinates, xi, and the corresponding function values, we may approximate this interpolation function or compute this interpolation function f hat as a linear combination, that is, we sum from I equals 1 to n, using Lagrange polynomials, which is to say we sort of multiply the given discrete function values, we are given with these crazy polynomials Li. So for every interval in our sampled function, we have a polynomial Li, and they are given like this. Right. This is the idea of Lagrange interpolation. And just for the fun of it, this is not really important, but just for the fun of it, what if we were to do this for only 2 points, say x0 and x1? So we can plug in, actually expand this sum here, basically like this, really sort of sum over very many sample points. Now we only do that for 2 sample points. So we go from 0 to 1 only. We have this product over these quotients here. We expand this sum, so f of xi becomes f of x0, and f of x1 becomes f of x1. These two corresponding products are rather simple products in this case. We get this, and then we do a lot of algebra, and in the end we find that this evaluates to f of x0 plus x minus x0 times f of x1 minus f of x0 over x1 minus x0, and that is what we discussed as linear interpolation. So here you have it once again, that when I'm talking about polynomial interpolation, this is just a more general case than the linear interpolation idea we discussed earlier. And I did it, just for you to see that what we are doing right now is a generalization of these really intuitive ideas we discussed earlier. And here is how that looks like. If we indeed were to compute this function here, this function, and I guess in our case we have 10 sample points, I'm not really sure, but this n is definitely not 1 anymore, but the number of sample points we are given. If I compute this, and this is really just plugging in stuff, right? We can do that. This immediately also would translate to program code. It's a for loop where you have to multiply something. Here's another for loop. You have to multiply lots of stuff and add all these things together, and you're done. If we do that, this is what we get for our case. Look, the blue one is the original continuous function. The black dots are representing the discrete sampled version. And the orange one, f hat, is our interpolation. And this looks not too shabby, right? It's fairly close. But what about this? No, this actually goes, I don't know. This is really a high peak. I had to cut it here. The problem with this idea is that if we apply this kind of polynomial interpolation rather naively, and we are given n plus 1 sample points, then the resulting Lagrange polynomial will be a polynomial of order n. And these polynomials of order n, they have lots of peaks and valleys, and in particular they tend to, well, oscillate, that is to say have lots of peaks and valleys, and they will overshoot, as we see here. This is undershooting. This is actually fairly harmless. This somehow is undershooting again, and here this really goes up to, I don't know, a couple of thousand overshooting. So this is it's not good. It's not good. We have to think of something better. And therefore, we now sort of combine the best of two worlds. We're talking about so-called cubic spline interpolation. Here the idea is, as in the case of the linear interpolation, to assume that the interpolation function f hat is stitched together from lots of simple functions. In the case of linear interpolation, we stitched it together using line segments. So we said it was piecewise linear. And here we want to have it piecewise polynomial. And in fact, we constrain the order of the polynomial to be 3. When I say cubic polynomials, what that means is that the order of the polynomial is 3. So, we are given lots of sample points, x1, x2, x2, x3, all the way to xn minus 1 and xn. And in between each two sample points, we assume that this interpolation function in between two sample points can be expressed as a polynomial. This is the Greek letter capital Phi, where this polynomial is cubic, it's of third order. And in general, that would mean that we have a coefficient ai, something raised to the power of 3, the coefficient bi, something raised to the power of 2, coefficient ci times something, and a constant which we call di. Right? And here you see sort of the similarity to the Lagrange polynomial. So this factors that depend on x are actually given by x minus xi. Right? Now, this is one of many such functions. Right? So actually, this is just one example out of n minus 1 such functions. Again, the picture said 1,000 words. Here are 4 sample points, and those are the corresponding cubic polynomials. This is already after I fitted it. This looks good. This is fairly smooth. The polynomial piece between xi minus 1 and xi is called phi I minus 1 of x. The polynomial piece between xi and xi plus 1 is called phi I of x. This polynomial piece between xi plus 1 and xi plus 2 is phi I plus 1 of x. So these are continuous functions, around this is here, and they have been stitched together. And of course, if we were to continue this function over here, then it would, you know, probably go like this. And if we were to continue this function down here, it would, you know, go down here. But we really don't want to continue. We just, you know, compute it in this interval, this one. This one is computed in this interval. This one is computed in this interval. And if we do this with the example we are discussing, then this is what we get. And this looks okay. So it is certainly not perfect, but this is something we have to live with, right? Because we are given insufficient information. for instance, this blue function is fairly smooth, and I have sampled it at equidistant points. But the blue function could as well look like this, right? And I still could have sampled it at certain points, and we just wouldn't know how it would look like in between. So if we apply this idea of cubic spline interpolation, and basically say, well, the individual splines, as they are called, are supposed to be cubic polynomials, we make a fairly strong assumption. If we would, instead of third order polynomials fit 20 order polynomials in between every two sums, we would get something like this. But when we do interpolation, we always assume that it is a good idea to get something that is fairly smooth. If the original function is smooth like this one, then it's okay. This is again for didactic purposes. But you have to be aware of the fact that if this original function is really crazy and you have sampled it at a few points only, you will have lost a lot of information. And there is no way for how to get it back. Right? So for what we are going to discuss now, be aware that this idea of using piecewise polynomials of order 3 is a strong assumption we make. This is why do we do this? We'll discuss that next time. But this is not a God-given thing. You could use any other kind of polynomials here. But if you do it like this, you will typically get very smooth results. And this is something we should strive for. Okay, the big elephant in the room is of course the question, where do we get those coefficients? There are lots of parameters in here, AI, BI, CI, DI, and not just these four, because we have to multiply this by n, right? How do we get those? And this is what we're going to discuss next. Two more things. It is very easy for us to compute the first and second derivative of a polynomial like this. This is the first derivative of phi I with respect to x. Basically says that a constant goes away. So if phi I is ai times x minus xi to the third power plus bi times x minus xi raised to the second power plus ci times x minus xi plus di, and we compute the first derivative, we get 3ai times x minus xi squared plus 2bi x minus xi plus c, d is gone, and if we compute the second derivative of the basic derivative of this one, we get 6ai times x minus xi plus 2bi. All right? And I will leave you with this picture while I get the board. Don't have to redraw the picture, right? You have that burned into your minds right now. If not, take a minute and just you know what? Let me draw it for you. Let me draw it for you. So here's, and I'll put it here. You can have a look at it all the way. Plus 2. color do I use for the polynomial? So red works. Yeah, that looks good. But it's not so smooth. Let me smooth that out. Ah. This is supposed to be something smooth. Again, this one here is phi I of x, and this one here is phi I plus 1 of x. We don't need this one for our discussion. While we're at it, we have time. Let me repeat the definition of each of these polynomials. So there are lots of functions fi. Each of these functions, phi I, each of these is a third order polynomial, which is to say we have phi I of x is ai x minus xi raised to the 3 plus bi x minus xi raised to the 2 plus ci x minus xi xi plus di, and because it's so beautiful, we also write down the derivatives 3ai x minus xi to the second plus 2 bi x minus xi plus ci, and the second derivative is 6ai x minus xi plus 2 bi. So this is the situation we are talking about. Very straightforward. Nothing special, and we have gained no insight yet. This is just, we are gathering information that is available to us. Now, and we are interested in the question how to determine these parameters, these 4 parameters for each of these splines. There are lots of splines. Each spline has 4 parameters, and we have to figure them out. And I note that in addition to these 3 equations, which are, this is our model. It's a model, something we assume. And this model immediately implies these 2 facts. And now we have to think about additional aspects of the model, so that we can indeed determine these parameters. And instead of different aspects of the model, I could use the mathematically more fancy term, constraints, additional things we assume, and they are as follows. So let me say, there are additional, let me say, smoothness requirements, or fancy term is constraints, which the function we are actually interested in, f hat of x, should satisfy. This is to say, in the end, we are interested in an interpolation function f hat, which is stitched together of lots of splines like these. And in order for the result to make sense, we have to do some more additional, deeper thinking. So, first of all, a very reasonable idea is to require, so the black dots here are the values of this discrete function f of xi. First thing we should strive for is an interpolation function f hat, which at the coordinates xi at the sample points we are given, right, has exactly the value of the discrete function at those sample points. So this interpolation function at each of these discrete coordinates should have the same value as the discrete function. And secondly, in order for this function f hat, let's say of x, to be smooth, we also require that phi I at xi plus 1 is the same as phi I plus 1 at xi plus 1. What does that mean? Here is the function phi I, and it continues, you know, to all infinity. But in this interval, this is the function phi I of x. And at xi plus 1 here, we want this function to have the same value as this function. This here is the function phi I plus 1 at xi plus 1. This is the function phi I at xi plus 1. And we do want that at the coordinate xi plus 1, two consecutive splines have the same value. They should coincide here. And then they will continue like whatever, we don't care. Right? But at this point, they should have the same value. Right? This is equation 1 from now on. And additionally, I'm not going to draw this, but I am requiring it. We also want that the first derivative of xi of phi I at xi plus 1 has exactly the same value as the first derivative of phi I plus 1 at xi plus 1. Again, the two derivatives of the function phi I and phi I plus 1 should have the same value at this coordinate. This is equation 2. And third of all, and of course you know how this will continue, right? Because we already had the second derivative as well, so it's obvious that we are also going to require this for the second derivative of phi I, which at coordinate xi plus 1 should assume the same value as the second derivative of phi I plus 1 at coordinate xi plus 1. This is equation 3. And before we continue, I will once again point out that there is no particular reason for us to require this, other than the result we want to obtain in the end should look beautifully smooth. Right? In order to determine all these parameters of all these splines, we have to, well, think about like how can we rearrange equations like this in order to be able to solve for these parameters. And we do not have enough information to do this up until here, so we have to introduce additional requirements, and I just did that. We could have chosen other requirements. These here are chosen such that the result will be rather smooth. Right? And this is a choice we make. If we want to interpolate something that is not so smooth, we could think of different additional requirements. But our idea is to interpolate a discrete function such that the corresponding continuous interpolation is smooth and well behaved. All right? And I already said that in general, when we are dealing with this kind of problem, the distance between the different xi, maybe in this figure you see those are probably a bit farther apart than these two. They don't need to be equidistant, right? But we're talking about digital images in the end. This is what we're talking about. And we want to interpolate in between pixel coordinates, and pixel coordinates are equidistant. Right? So I will immediately introduce another piece of information which for our application domain is a given. Namely, I'll talk about the distance between any two xi plus 1 and xi, the difference between two consecutive sample points is a constant. Not in this picture, but for images it is. And I will call this one h. And this will simplify our lives. In general, we would not have to do this, but we are not really interested in the general situation here. Our interest is in understanding interpolation for image processing. For image processing, we can assume that the sample points, pixel coordinates, are equidistant. Let's call the distance h, and this will tremendously simplify what's coming. Okay, now, how can we make use of the information we have given? How can we make use of the information according to our model? Once again, last time I said, the idea of cubic spline interpolation is a strong one. It's an assumption we make. Why should those be third order polynomials? Could be 20 order polynomials, who cares, right? But we want them to be third order polynomials. If we want that, and we want the result to be smooth, we have a couple of equations, and I refer to these equations as the information that is available to us. And how can we use that information? So, from equation 1, we can deduce we have, well, remember that we said, well, the value of the discrete function f of xi should coincide with the value of the interpolation function at xi. And the interpolation function at xi is of course given by the value of the polynomial phi I at xi. Alright? So the overall red thing here is f hat. Let me probably also indicate that. So this overall red thing is f hat of x, and it is stitched together from lots of polynomials. And apparently at xi we want the interpolation to have the same value as the discrete function that is available to us, and this value is of course the value of phi I at xi. Right? Now let's rewrite this information so that this equation implies that left hand side f of xi, the discrete function, right hand side is phi I of xi, and I will now plug in the definition for phi I of xi. And this is simply ai times xi minus xi raised to the third plus bi xi minus xi to the second plus ci xi minus xi plus di. Right? phi I at xi is really given like this. Phi I of x was x minus xi and x minus xi, and now for the x we substitute xi. So we have lots of xi minus xi, xi minus xi, xi minus xi, but what does that mean? They're all zero, right? But this is to say that all of this is 0 times something is 0. This is 0 times something is 0. This is 0 times something. Here is something that is not 0. So we have found the first parameter, di. This is just the di's in these cubic polynomials are just the values of the discrete function f of xi we are given. Or, in other words, bringing it back to the cubic polynomials we're interested in, phi I at xi is exactly di. This is equation 5. All right. Ah! Why did I do that? Anyway. You have the picture now, right? Yeah, sorry about that. Should not have done that, but anyway. So we have uncovered the first parameter. And together with what I called equation 2, this provides the following insight. Note that we said that phi I plus 1 at coordinate xi plus 1 is supposed to have the same value as phi I at xi plus 1 is supposed to have the same value as phi I plus 1 at xi plus 1, right? We wanted to have them the same value at these sample points. And given what we just uncovered, we know that for phi I plus 1 at xi plus 1, this will be di plus 1. All right. This is called 6. Two consecutive splines at the point where they meet should have the same value. We said that phi I at xi equals di. Accordingly, phi I plus 1 at xi plus 1 equals di plus 1, but this is the same value. So this is another piece of information we have uncovered. And we also have let me see if the other pen works better. Let me just once again rewrite or write down our definition. We also have that, phi I at xi plus 1. Once again, this is ai times xi plus 1 minus xi. I'm substituting xi plus 1 for x now. Right. Raised to the power of 3 plus bi xi plus 1 minus xi raised to the power of 2 plus ci xi plus 1 minus xi plus di. Okay. What is this? Xi plus 1 minus xi? H. Right. Great. So we don't have to worry about this anymore. So therefore, using what I called equation 6, we have, and the facts say, and that h is xi plus 1 minus xi, we have the following identity now. di plus 1 is ai times h cubed plus bi times h squared plus ci times h plus di. Right. This is 7. This is, okay, why is this a good thing? H is something we should know, right? Something that we know. And now apparently this is an equation that relates a couple of these parameters we have to estimate to each other, and it does not involve a lot of things that are scary. There are still a lot of things we don't really know. Some of them we know already, right? But you know, some of them are still unknown to us. But we have brought it down to a form that looks manageable. Right? We will continue this because note that so far all we have done was based on the original cubic spline polynomial. But I have also written down the first and second derivative. So I will do the same for the first and second derivative now, and we'll see what that gives us. And maybe I should say, all of this is again very crazy. This is lots of manipulation of mathematical equations, and it is not entirely clear why we do it like that. Somebody had this idea at some point in time of the history of humankind, and it worked. So we really are dependent on these inspired people who see that for the first time. It looks like mumbo jumbo. Right? And to a certain extent it is, because we introduce new symbols, we call them h, we relate di plus 1 to di. Why? Where does that come from? It has been developed some 100 years ago. Somebody was very smart. That's basically the bottom line. This is where this comes from. And in analogy to what we have done for phi I, we now go through the same process for phi prime I. In analogy, like basically really just the same arguments. In analogy, we have from what I called equation 3 that phi I prime evaluated at xi plus 1 is 3ai, I'll write it, xi plus 1 minus xi to the 2 plus 2bi xi plus 1 minus xi plus ci. And this is supposed to be, so this is phi I prime at xi, and it's supposed to be, this is what we required in equation 3, to be the same as phi I plus 1 prime at xi plus 1. So these are different functions, but they are supposed to have the same value at xi. And here is the analogy to what we did previously. This, of course, will evaluate to ci plus 1. This is sort of the analogy to what we discussed earlier, that these first order derivatives at their left point will have the value of the constant in this now second order polynomial. And this is that the polynomial fi, phi I prime should have the same value at xi plus 1 as phi I plus 1 prime. I compacted this a bit, but this is really just the three arguments we discussed earlier, now repeated for the case of the first derivative. But this is to say, and here is sort of the final kicker out of that, and there's always equal signs here, right? So this ci plus 1 equals this. Right? Now this is to say that ci plus 1 is 3a I times h squared plus 2bi times h plus ci. This is called equation 8. Do you see where this is going? This repeats what we discovered for the d's, it repeats it for the c's. Okay? So let me do that for the second derivative, and of course this will now be very repetitive, so I just write it down. So this was equation 8. Ci plus 1 equals 3ai h squared plus 2bi h plus ci. In analogy, we have from 4 that phi 2 prime phi I 2 prime at xi plus 1 is 6 xi plus 1 minus xi plus 2bi, and I'll write it just as I did it previously. This is supposed to be the same as phi I plus 1 2 prime at xi plus 1, which will be evaluated to 2bi plus 1. There's a slight difference here. The constant now has a factor of 2, but if you walk to the argument we discussed for the original polynomial, if you do the same for the second order derivative, you'll find that this 2 actually is, of course, justified. And that is to say, this is the same as 2bi plus 1 equals 6ai times h plus 2bi, and I will call this one 9. Okay. And to me, the mumbo jumbo starts now. Because this is all, at least to me, this is all reasonable. It looks, why would you do that? But, once you have the idea, that is reasonable. Now starts the real inspired stuff. If I would have to develop something like this, I probably would get until here, and then you need genius. So let's see. We have uncovered 3 equations so far. One that relates the bi plus 1s to the bi's somehow, one that does that for the ci's, one for the di's. Now, of course, we are interested in the ai's. And I have to remove the analogy here. I will now simplify the notation because I'm lazy. Simplifying notation, that is, I will substitute, I'll introduce a new name, and this will be our new friend, capital M-I. I really don't know, I found that somewhere, it's capital M-I, whatever, is the same as 2bi. I'm too lazy to write 2bi. That's basically what this is. But this says that bi is mi over 2. Right. And with this, then equation 9 becomes, so remember that we had, where was it? 6aih Just rewriting this equation 9 is 2bi plus 1 minus 2bi, which is now, with our new friend, the same as mi plus 1 minus mi. This is a different way of writing equation 9. I have sort of moved all things that have to do with b on one side of the equation, all things that have to do with a on the other side. And this is something we can easily solve for ai. So the coefficient ai can be expressed as mi plus 1 minus mi over 6h. Okay, where are we right now? We have found a different expression for those coefficients ai. This still depends on something we don't know. Right? This something we don't know also allows us to talk about the bi's. So we are now given sort of two equations, something for ai, something for bi, depending on stuff we don't know, but maybe we can figure that out. What about the ci's? Let's plug all of this into what we found for the ci's, right? And this will get nasty. Let me see if the, oh yeah. This is now, it will look very daunting, but it is just, did I call this one, the last one was equation 11, so this one here, the one I just erased is called 11, all right? The ai equals, okay, ai equals mi plus 1 minus mi over 6h. This is 11. All right? Can keep it, because now, using 10, did I define 10? 10 was, bi is mi over 2, this is 10. So, now we're good. Using 10, 11, and going back to 5, we rewrite 8. Okay, so if you look it up, 10, 11, 5, and 8, all sort of mixed together now gives us that Ci can be expressed as f at xi plus 1 minus f at xi divided by h minus mi plus 1 plus 2 mi divided by 6 times h. Trust me. Trust me. This is just plugging all our definitions for bi, ai, and di. This comes from the di, these things here come from the ai's and bi's, so this gives us a new way of writing ci. Okay, this is great, because now we are at a point where everything depends on something we know and something we don't know, but maybe we can now use that to solve for the stuff we don't know yet. Right? I also recall that one more thing and then we are good. Ci plus 1 is 3 ai times h squared plus 2 bi, I should not write it down like this again, plus ci, and again plugging in the stuff, and now this will have to be plugged in here and it looks horrible. So what I will do is I will erase this line, I will erase that back there. I will basically plug this into this place. I will plug this into this place. And I will plug this here. Okay? Let's go. This is the same as blah 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 and so on and so forth. So and also, okay, so one more thing. This is the definition of Ci, and here we have Ci plus 1. If I increase the plus 1 here, like this is I plus 2, I plus 1, I plus 2, I plus 1. Right, so, and I already said that I will plug in all these things at the corresponding places, and everything with I plus 2 will also be like, I'll just write down the equation that pops out by equating this to this. Okay? And I'm really too lazy to do it all. So, will I upload slides? Okay, maybe for the next slides I'll give you all of this. So, okay. In the end, I'm going to move this. It's horrible, but you know, and people did that back when they didn't have computational algebra packages. Nowadays you go to Wolfram Alpha, you enter some equation, you hit return, wait a second, get the result. But they had to do it all by hand. Can be done, but you know, the possibility to make mistakes is huge, but still, that is how mathematics was done up until 50 years ago. This yields all of this. Okay, in the end, we have 3 mi plus 1 minus mi over 6h times h squared plus 2 mi times h plus f of xi plus 1 minus f of xi divided by h minus, I'm not done yet, minus mi plus 1 plus 2 mi divided by 6 times h. So this is basically rewriting Ci, and now we are rewriting Ci plus 1 is the same as f of xi plus 2 minus f of xi divided by h minus mi plus 2 plus 2 mi plus 1 divided by 6 times h divided by 6 times h. Alright, this is cool because now we are finally in a situation where we are still dealing with a lot of unknowns, and they are called mi now, mi plus 1, mi plus 2. But everything depends on stuff we know. H we know is something we can compute previously, and all these function values of the discrete function we also know. And then this equation, and I'm really not walking through this, sorry. Just write that. So what I will now do without going through the details, I will rewrite, this is an equation, here's the equation sign. Can you see it? Here. Here's the equation sign. So all of this equals that, and I will now isolate all the unknowns on one side. That is basically lots of m's, they are unknown. And I will put them on one side of the equation sign, and everything that is known will end up on the other side of the equation sign. Without details. But I can't do that. This is really, if you want to ruin your afternoon, go through it. So, this can be written as, and I'll just write it down, mi plus 4 mi plus 1 plus mi plus 2 equals 6 over h squared times f of xi minus 2f of xi plus 1 plus f of xi plus 2. Okay. And this is not the only equation we get. This is just what we get if we consider phi I. But we have a lot of i's, right? So we have actually, for I is 1 all the way up to n minus 2. That is to say, going through this exercise, we end up with n minus 2 equations for n unknowns. Okay? This is not one equation because of the dependence of I. These are actually, you can write them down, insert 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on for the i's. You get a system of equations. Right? But this is a system that is linear in the unknowns. There is no crazy cosine here or something raised to the power of 3 or 2. This is a linear equation for 1i in the unknowns. And that is to say that we can write the system of equations as a matrix vector equation, which is great because that tells us that we can easily solve this just by inverting the matrix. All right? And since I'm really too lazy to write down this matrix, I have them on the slides. So let's go back to the slide. So this is where we came from. We assume that we are given a discrete function that is defined at certain discrete sample points. The black dots are the discrete function, and we want to come up with a continuous function that mimics the behavior of the discrete one, but provides us with values in between two sample points as well. We said it is probably a good idea, it's at least an inspired idea, to assume that this function f hat is stitched together from cubic polynomials. They are splines called spline. Spline is a tiny piece of wood that can be bent, so this is where this name comes from. Imagine this was a piece of wood which is clamped here, and then you force it out. But this is, you know, why it's called splines. We said the interpolation function can be stitched together from polynomials, third order polynomials, for which we require additional smoothness constraints. Once we have done this, we end up with this. This was the last thing we had on the whiteboard. Only depends on known things. I should have called this xi here. Anyway, these are n minus 2 equations for unknown variables mi, but all of these equations on the right hand side depend on stuff that we know. And if we write this, okay, so one more thing. These are just n minus 2 equations, but we have n unknowns. This is a bad thing, which basically says that where we are so far is an underdetermined system of equations. Not enough information there to solve it all. There's different ways of how that can be addressed, and without further ado, simplest one is to say, okay, m1 and mn are just 0. And if we make this choice, then this is usually called natural splines. There are different ways. We can introduce more constraints into our equations and blah blah. I am really not. In the end, this is what we get. I will not ask about this in the exam. Why did I do that? So, you have to know what it is you are working with. Right? If you use software that does spline interpolation, you now know what this does. And because you know what this does, because you know what assumptions have been made to come up with this, this can be solved. We just have to basically invert this matrix and multiply it from the left, so then we have this vector here and this one multiplied by the inverse. It can be done. Right? There's lots of computation, but for your computer, you know, it's like eating breakfast. No problem there. So this can definitely be solved for these unknowns, and then we can use these to compute the B's, and to compute the A's, and to compute the C's, and the D's were given anyway. All right? So we're good. Can be done. No problem there. And it's actually, you know, it's not really super fast, but on modern computers for large images, and we'll discuss how to do this in 2D next time, but no problem at all, instantaneously. Why did we walk through this? Because now you know what spline interpolation is. And in particular, you know that there are fairly strong assumptions being made when you interpolate something using splines. Right? The results typically look very pleasing, at least from this rather imprecise notion of human perception of aesthetics, whatever. Like these interpolation functions are really smooth. Here is the matrix equation that results from this system of equations here. And this can be solved, no problem there, and we are done. What have we learned today? So, at the beginning, we discussed what we are going to discuss for the next couple of lectures. Warping of images. We saw that if we want to compute a warped image, there is the naive way of doing that. That is by pushing the coordinate values from the image we are given to the coordinates in the image we want to compute, which leads to certain problems. Or the smart solution, the pull warps, which iterate over the coordinates in the destination image and pull the color or intensity values from the corresponding coordinates in the original image. And we saw that this idea of computing pull warps necessitates interpolation. We have to think about how to get values from in between pixel coordinates. And then we studied 3 different kinds of interpolation methods. Actually 4, but I already ignoring the Lagrange polynomials here. We looked at the idea of nearest neighbor interpolation. We looked at the idea of linear interpolation. And we looked at the idea of cubic spline interpolation. All for the case of one-dimensional functions. Next time, we'll ever so briefly, I will never use the whiteboard again from now on. So next time, we'll ever so briefly look at how this translates to two-dimensional interpolation. It's very straightforward. And then we'll have fun with lots of warps. Note that I have singled out these 3 on the summary slide. And this is because in practice, you only need to know about these 3. And these 3 are the ones that are being used in practice. This is extremely fast. And this is, we'll see that next time, extremely pleasing. But you have modern computers, you know, it's fast, but this is ridiculously fast. And this is a compromise between the 2. So basically, I'm not really sure if what I'm saying is correct right now, but from what I know, You need to know about these three things. They are the ones that appear in all the software you will ever be using in your life. Now you understand what that does, and you can confidently use libraries or software that does interpolation for you. Actually, NumPy does it for you. Right. So now go ahead and use it, because now you know what it does. That is all I have for today. Are there any questions? Great. Once again, I promise no whiteboard anymore. So from now on, it will be just plain fun. And see you on Monday then.